Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Dr. Joe Rigney. Dr. Rigney serves as Fellow of Theology at New St. Andrews College. He's the author of 6 books, the most recent of which is Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, Resisting the Anxiety That Will Wreck Your Family, Destroy Your Church, and Ruin the World. Dr. Rigney is, quote, convinced that he's descended from King Loon of Archenland on his father's side. Previously, Dr. Rigney served as a professor and president of Bethlehem College and Seminary in Minneapolis, a pastor at City's Church in St. Paul, and a teacher at Desiring God. Joe, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Hey, thanks for having me, Josh.
Well, I have to tell you, you are the first guest I've had on the show while I've been over at Thales College that any of my students are interested in. I have one student who saw an early misscheduled notification on LinkedIn that you were coming on the show, and he tracked me down the next day. It's like, when is Dr. Rigney happening? When is that episode?
That's great. Awesome.
So
glad I'm reaching the youths.
Yes, indeed. Well, Joe, tell us a little bit. I know I read some of your details in the bio, but tell us a little bit of your story and your kind of areas of interest and anything you want to say about your ancestry in Archenland. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, that's like that was probably like one of my first little, literary jokes for my first book. So I grew up in West Texas in a Christian home. I was baptized at 12 at the local Baptist church, and then was kind of a youth group kid, Bible studies and stuff, and played high school football at a public high school in West Texas, Friday Night Lights. Went to Texas A&M, where I met my wife and became Reformed, largely through kind of Piper's influence, reading his books and articles and various things in college. Met my wife there, and then we got married and moved to Minnesota, where I went to seminary at Bethlehem. And then basically stuck around. I was in the right place at the right time as they were building out what is now Bethlehem College and Seminary. And so I kind of helped build that for about 18 years before most recently moving to Moscow and taking a position here at New St. Andrews. So now I'm out here in the West. So I've lived from Texas to Minnesota to Idaho as kind of the geographic pilgrimage. In terms of like what's interesting, I would say so the first book I wrote was Live Like a Narnian back in like 2013 because it was it was the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death. We were having a conference. I'd wanted to write a book on it. It seemed the right time, so I wrote Live Like a Narnian, and in it King Loon is like one of my favorite Narnia characters, and so I just included that I'm descended from him. He's a relative. And so now that's just like in the bio somewhere. And so now, so every time I do that, nobody's brought it up in a while. So like, oh yeah, I did that. Back in the day. So, and so then, let's see, interests. I teach theology and literature here at New St. Andrews. It's what I've taught for years. So I love teaching both kind of biblical theology and systematics, PhD and Jonathan Edwards. But I also really love teaching literature. So I love teaching Shakespeare. I love teaching Lewis. I love teaching kind of English lit, British lit. Sometimes just a little bit of like Dante thrown in there and a little bit of like Russian Dostoevsky stuff. But by and large, Shakespeare, Milton, Jane Austen, Lewis, Tolkien, that's kind of my sweet spot when it comes to the lit. So I love teaching literature. And I love teaching theology. So that's kind of that's the rough and ready.
Oh, fantastic. What's a great collection of areas. And as much as I would love to follow a lot of those rabbit trails, we might circle back to some of the other books you like to teach. I want to go to your most recent book because your title fascinates me. Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. You list a lot of things also in the subtitle. So I wonder if you could walk us through what you mean by emotional sabotage. What is it? And why do you think it's going to have these catastrophic effects on the family, the church, and the entire world?
Yeah, so the title actually was kind of a collaborative effort with Canon in coming up with how do we actually describe in a pithy and provocative way what this book's about. But the short of it is everybody has a sense that we're living in a kind of an age of anxiety, agitation, turmoil, unraveling. People talk about the great sort. And so this massive transition time, which then produces at a kind of subconscious environmental level. So it's both internal, but it's also kind of in the air, a sense that of angst, a sense of we don't know what's going to happen, of who's driving this car, where's it going to end, that then has these really negative, destructive effects on the institutions of society. So the family, the church, the world, the government, the state, all those kind of things. And so in my case, I kind of came into that awareness or having words to describe that in two different ways. One was from Edwin Friedman, who was a Jewish rabbi and family systems counselor in the 90s, who wrote a book called A Failure of Nerve, which in the last 10 years, I'd say has kind of had a renaissance that kind of made its way into Christian circles. And it did that for me probably, 10, 15 years ago. And just found it very insightful in describing that kind of anxiety and angst that's kind of in the air that pervades the institutions. And he's writing in the 90s, and I would just say what he was dealing with has only gotten worse as we've moved into the internet era, the social media era. And so that's one entry. The other entry was Shakespeare, who I love to teach. And Shakespeare, I just had some great stuff about the kind of disintegration of the social order, and that institutions just kind of fall apart and become impotent, they both either shut down or they blow up. And it has to do with, in his analysis, it's not just a matter of external forces. Big things happen, hard things happen outside of you, but really has to do with with leadership and with the way that if it's an army, the way the generals are oriented. If it's a home, it's the parents. If it's a nation, it's the king or the prince or whatever. But in all these cases, there's something about the leader that kind of lends the body that he's the head of to disintegrate and kind of fall apart. And that's an emotional sabotage comes in, because basically that angst means that when a leader who's supposed to be the shock absorber for his institution, he's supposed to absorb all of that angst. When it gets to be too much, then when he tries to lead faithfully, when he tries to lead and say, this is what this institution's about, we're going to be on mission, he's going to be sabotaged. The angst will mean that he'll get kneecapped in a variety of ways. And so you should expect, in the kind of environment that we're in, if you seek to lead faithfully, it's not going to be all sweetness and light. It's not going to, you're not going to just get applause. You'll also get assault. You'll also get attacked. You'll get undermined, manipulated. People will attempt to steer you. And so it's that phenomenon that I was really trying to go for, to take some of Friedman's really good insights and basically and Shakespeare and kind of root them in a more biblical soil and show, how does the Bible address this thing? Because it does. It's everywhere, both the failures as well as successes. And so what is it? What's needed from leaders, and then how does that work itself out in the home, in the church, and in the world?
There's so many interesting things there. Could you help us with some examples of what you mean by faithful leaders being kneecapped? What does that practically look like?
Yeah, so I'd say one of the common ones, I talk about this, I think in chapter 3 of the book, is the way that slander and insinuation can act as a kind of steering wheel. So I talk about steering wheels a lot because basically a lot of times those labels that people slap on you are attempts to steer you, because we want to. All human beings have a natural desire to be liked and to please others. That's just a normal feature of human life. And so people know that labels are powerful. And so if you can slap a label on someone, then if they're doing something you don't want them to do, slap the label on them, and then they might back off. And the world has learned that Christians in particular, I think, are susceptible to this because we want to have a good testimony. We want to have a good reputation with outsiders. The Bible tells us to do that. And so because of that, over time, the world learns that's a steering wheel. And so all we have to do is figure out what label, what insult, what name, what accusation do we have to attach to this person in order to get them to back down or go where we want them to go. And so that's a pretty kind of common example of, when a Christian gives a, basically, a standard Christian argument for something, whether it's abortion or manhood, womanhood, or any of these things. And immediately the label is you're a hater, you're a bigot, you're a misogynist, you're a racist, you're a Christian nationalist. All of these things are meant to be steering wheels. They slap them on your back and then they want to steer you with them. And so I think recognizing that that's a pretty common tactic, and that if you don't recognize it, then you will end up getting steered. So that's one kind of really common way that the world tries to steer us and sabotage. Because what it does is it takes you off mission. Rather than you saying, hey, this is what my, say, church, this is what we're here for, this is the mission God has given us in the world to preach the gospel, administer the sacraments, seek the good of the cities. We're trying to do that. And then as you're doing it, here come the labels. And now you're spending all your time trying, no, we're not that. Oh, no. And you're just doing PR, image management kind of stuff. And now you're derailed. You're not effective. You can't accomplish the mission that God has supplied you because you're getting steered or paralyzed or sabotaged by the world or by other Christians for that matter. One of the really gnarly bits about this is that oftentimes worldly influences are sort of laundered through other Christians, compromised Christians, who the pressure isn't direct from the world, because often Christians can kind of go, well, if these godless pagans hate us, well, they hated Jesus too. The hard thing is when, there's a group out there that responds negatively and you don't care, but then there's this other church that cares. Well, you don't care about what that church thinks or that person because they're not in your community and you think they're compromised. You may not care, but maybe like another elder on your pastoral team cares what that group thinks. And so now, and he's the one who's coming to you saying, hey, do you really have to say that? Hey, can you stop? Don't poke the bear. And so he's being reasonable. He'll grant all sorts. Yeah, I know that they overreacted. Yes, I know this. Yes, I know that. But don't you think that you could have maybe done something a little different? And that's actually the pressure. And calling it sabotage is deliberate. Friedman uses that term, but recognizing like it is sabotage, but it's done with a kind of a smiley face and very reasonably, because the question is not in that circumstance. It's not, well, what I said true? Is what I said, faithful to the moment? In other words, am I addressing the sins that are present in our community or that need to be addressed? Those questions are sort of minimized with, yeah, but look at the effect, look at the response, look at the reaction, look at the blow up that just happened because you said what you said. And so now, hey, maybe you need to dial it in, rate it in. And that's the one that's really hard to resist. It's the worldly pressure being laundered through nice Christians.
That I want to come back to that term "nice" here in a minute, but as you were describing that, I was hearing a lot of echoes of Aaron Renn's book, "Living in a Negative World." I just finished reading that, and he talks in there about the need for Christians to develop resilience, and he's primarily focusing on an individual level, at least on financial resilience is the big one. He's like, he wants Christians who have views who actually hold to the convictions of traditional biblical Christianity are at risk of losing their jobs and need to develop enough financial resilience to retain that. It sounds to me like you're making a similar argument for the leader in a Christian community, that there needs to be a resilience and a holding firm to the truth that really orients the leader. Is that fair?
That's right. Yeah. You want your community to be, in the anti-fragile. So not just resilient. You want it to be anti-fragile, meaning that when the slanders come, when the falsehoods are made, the accusations, you can do. You're steady and stable and have enough grounding to be able to consider, is this true? So it's not. I don't want to commit any kind of reactionary. I'll just dismiss all criticism as mean-spirited and sabotage, because there's time where criticism might be true. So you need to have enough. The virtue I commend in the book is sort of the heart. The heart of it is sober-mindedness, and that sober-mindedness means you can actually sort of emotionally have the right amount of distance to be able to consider, is what this person's saying true? And you need that in your home. Like if your wife is trying to bring something to you, you don't want to get weirdly emotional, if she's giving you constructive feedback, you want to be able to consider it, think about it, weigh it, and then appropriate what you need to. But also then be willing to say, okay, but actually that's not true. And so I'm not going to let that steer me. And so that's right. So and then the flip side, what that's brilliance, if you're just able to endure. The real aim, right, with anti-fragile in the way that word gets tossed out since I was at Talib, whoever wrote that book, is that not only does the criticism or the stress, not only do you endure it, but it actually helps you to mature and grow and become stronger. And so there's a way in which using those accusations, using the sabotage as an opportunity for growth is even a step beyond. And leaders ought to be looking for that kind of thing. It is a necessity in negative world to develop strong, stable, healthy communities filled with sober-minded people who aren't emotional dominoes who just react to worldly pressure.
Now I think it's so intriguing that you drew on Shakespeare for inspiration, because of course he's writing his plays roughly 400 years ago. To what extent is this a perennial problem? Do you see this as being something that is a regular problem of human communities that's gotten worse in recent years? Or is this just always a part of the interactions between Christian communities and a secular world?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because I do think it is a universal feature of, the kind of leadership abdication that I'm trying to warn against, that failure of nerve, that withdrawal, that abdication. It's as old as Adam, and it's all throughout the scriptures, and you can find countless examples. In the same time, I do think I would want to say that certain eras, certain moments in history, the anxiety dial is turned up to 11. And we live in one of those times where it's not, and it's usually a time of disintegration where you've got a lot of fast-paced change, and the institutions that ought to help, absorb that change and provide a steadiness aren't functioning properly. And they're not functioning properly because the leaders within them are not able to govern themselves, manage themselves, steward their own passions, but instead become just one more domino to where, it's basically, I describe it as kind of anxiety storms where it's often unpredictable. You don't know what the thing is that's going to set everybody off, but like something's going to, here comes the lightning strike, boom. And then the community acts like a channel and it just kind of courses through it. Now, in a healthy community, a sober-minded leader can be the place where it absorbs it and it dies. But in these really intense times, the leader can actually just channel it back into the system, and now it's just building and churning and building and churning. And then you end up with, Friedman calls it herding, I call it social stampedes, where, in response to something, everybody just reacts and runs one direction, and then everybody reacts and runs another direction. And it's just, emotional dominoes falling every which way. And the antidote really is sober-minded leadership that has gravity, that has some ballast in the boat. I define sober-mindedness in the book as a clarity of mind, meaning you're not clouded, your vision's not clouded, but you see clearly what's going on. A stability of soul. There's a ballast in the boat that's kind of, you're grounded in the gospel, you're grounded in who God is. You're not trying to, control things you can't control, but there's a stability of I'm trusting God. And then there's a readiness to act. So you're not just an observer who doesn't get moved, but instead you're leaning, there's a forward lean that says, I'm ready to be faithful in the moment when I need to be faithful. I'm not just going to be a passive bump on a log, but I'm ready to lean in. And that sort of thing. Then, one of the guys at Canon, when he talked about the book, said, you're trying to produce the kind of leader who, when there's a crisis and that guy walks in the room, all of the healthy people go, oh, thank God. Right? You want to be the sort of person when in the crisis, you walk in the room and everybody goes, oh, thank God he's here. That's what you should aim for. Now, the flip side of that is there's a whole bunch of other people who, when you walk in the room, light their hair on fire because, in other words, they're, oh no, because he might actually name the elephant in the room that everybody else is trying to ignore. Everybody else is trying to paper over the controversy, keep it under wraps. And when Paul shows up at Antioch and Peter's withdrawn, nobody wants to talk about the fact that Peter withdrew and everybody withdrew, and it's just kind of the crackles in the air. And Paul shows up, and there's a bunch of people who go, "Oh no, he's going to say something," and you want to be that leader too. So it's like it's both reassuring the sheep, but it's also the more reactive, immature members need to have a little bit of a "oh no," because you're not going to be steered by the typical manipulative tactics.
So is Paul then an example of this model of leadership in action? And are there other biblical figures you would point to as here's what this looks like in a biblical scenario?
Yeah, so I think I use Paul a number of times in the book, both. So the Antioch situation is a good one where Peter is acting hypocritically because of fear, out of fear. So it's emotional sabotage, right? So certain men, this is a good example of the, way it gets laundered. You got the circumcision group out there, which basically, is putting pressure on the church in Jerusalem. Then James sends messengers to Peter saying, "Hey, people hear that you're, I'm speculating a little bit about what the message was, but, hey, you eating with the Gentiles is sure causing us some problems here. And it'd be really great if you can just kind of back off." And Peter fears the circumcision group and he withdraws. And because of that, cowardice is contagious. And so the rest of the Jews join him. Even Barnabas, that phrase there, even Barnabas, the son of encouragement, was led astray by their hypocrisy. And so they withdraw. And there's a great example of a failure of nerve, a failure of courage. And then Paul sees it and says, there's a lot at stake here. And he then goes and opposes Peter to his face. He's not going to withdraw. He's not going to be steered. He's not going to keep quiet. Instead, he's going to say, I'm going to calmly and sober-mindedly address this in public in a way that will make it was probably pretty awkward. Like when you think about that confrontation between, the apostle to the Gentiles, who everybody's like, this guy was, persecutor and he became a Christian. Isn't it great? Now he's out doing it. And then Peter, right, the lead apostle. And now everybody's just watching as that crackle and room. And Paul calmly says, hey, you're acting like a hypocrite here. You know that there's no dividing wall between Jew and Gentile, and yet you're acting like there is. And in doing so, you're compromising justification by faith. You're acting like you need the works of the law. If this is true, Peter, Christ died for nothing. And so he just goes right at it. That's a great example of sober-minded challenge in the face of a social crisis in the early church. So Paul is a great example of that the kind of leadership I'm commending. Yeah.
I really like that phrase, cowardice is contagious. And it seems, I was looking through your table of contents, your last two chapters all focused on courage. I wonder if you could speak for a moment about courage, and particularly, where do you see the need for courage in the home, the church, and the world?
Yeah, so there is a little bit of I flow back and forth kind of naturally between talking about sober-mindedness and talking about courage, and they are related. So, but in terms of the courage, in the home, I think one of the main places it's needed is a dad has to be dialed into the emotional crackle in his household. He's got to have enough, and he often learns about that crackle by being self-aware, knowing when is he flinching, when are his emotions rising, I'm frustrated, I feel tense, all of those sort of, he finds himself leaning or avoiding certain things. His awareness of his own passions often is an indicator of the past at home, and is a way that he needs to then lean in and say, okay, I've been put precisely with these things, to draw them out, to get curious about them. And so that requires, again, that sober-minded steadiness to be able to not be emotionally reactive, but instead to say, I'm going to be compassionate, I'm going to be curious, I'm going to be patient. And that does require courage. It does require, I'm going to be willing to address things with my wife that may be uncomfortable for us. I'm going to have the hard conversation and not subscribe to the, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy school of husbanding, because that's a recipe for just, it's abdicating. So that's home. Church, I would say the example that Paul gives there in Galatians is really important. And the modern equivalent would be something like, which Christians are you unwilling to associate with? Where does it require courage for you to say? And that could mean you may not agree with them on stuff, right? But you still regard them as faithful brothers and sisters. But who are you willing to sort of put your arm around and say, these are my people because these are Jesus's people? Versus at times there's a temptation for Christians to kind of throw other Christians under the bus in order to be winsome to unbelieving audiences. And it's a temptation across the board. It's not just one group of Christians or another, but it's always like, who are my people? Who has God put in the people of God? Who does Jesus welcome? If Jesus welcomes them, then I want to say, yep, they're in their family. Doesn't mean you can't criticize and criticize sharply, like Paul did Peter, but it does mean that there's a recognition of that kind of fundamental identity, and it often takes courage to say, nope, I'm with them. And in the world, the book of Acts is just this remarkable, these remarkable narratives that are massively relevant for the present cultural moment, because Paul in Acts is going back to Jerusalem. He's trying to be a peacemaker, and then riots break out, and false accusations start flying. He gets beaten. He gets arrested. The Romans have no idea what's going on. They're trying to figure out why these Jews are rioting, and it's not making any sense. And Paul is mistaken for hey, aren't you that Egyptian who, tried to lead a bunch of assassins into the wilderness to form an army? And it's like, it's like, that's the equivalent of like, aren't you like a January 6th, insurrectionist? It's that kind of mistaken identity. And Paul's like, I'm just a Jew from Tarsus. Can I go talk to the people? He just wants to get back on mission, back on message, and go out and give his testimony. And there's a great example of courage in the face of absolute chaos. It's at all Jerusalem was in chaos, and Paul is not thrown. He's like, I was built for this. God is with me, and I'm gonna step up to the mic and speak clearly, and I'm gonna try to commend Christ, and I'm gonna put my finger boldly on the sins of this crowd in order to call them to follow Christ. And it ends up, it ends with more mob. Like, it doesn't know, but there's, you're poised at the moment of, is this going to be a revival or is it going to be a riot? And it ends up being a riot. And Paul gets arrested, and there's this whole other, story goes on. But it is a remarkable thing that Paul, in the midst of this chaos, is just as cool as a cucumber. He's steady. He's sober-minded because he's trusting the Lord.
I had the chance to teach through Acts with my church a couple of years ago, and it was absolutely fascinating thinking through. This would have been 2022 as we're reading through Acts, and I kept coming around to tell our guys in our Bible study, like, obviously Luke is not writing about 2022, and he doesn't work for IBM or for any of the other companies that are here in the Raleigh area. That the folks in my Bible study were in all different business sectors, but obviously Paul's not thinking about that, and yet we keep hitting these moments that Paul is wrestling with, faced with these cultural moments. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So what does it look like to minister to proclaim the gospel there, and where the gospel is creating economic disruption and putting people out of work? No more idol factories if Jesus is king. And then, like when he shows up and the people are like, oh, it is Zeus and Hermes. Let us bring you a sacrifice. And all of these crazy moments. And I think you're right that Acts is a great text for our day today, because in so many ways, the 21st century, if maybe to speak very, very broadly for a moment, if postmodernism was a movement to try to get back to a pre-modern world, what we're at today is sort of there's biblical Christianity, and then there's neo-paganism, and in the interaction between this faithful Christianity that's doing the same thing it's been doing for 2,000 years and neo-paganism, we're right back to Paul proclaiming the one truth of Jesus in the midst of the world.
Yeah, that's right, and it is interesting. I think when Paul is cool as a cucumber in all of these settings, the one time that he seems to get kind of riled up, he's provoked that one time in Athens, I guess, at Marcel. The idols provoke him in his spirit, but the one time that he kind of is like oh no, is when they try to worship him. It's like the one, he's, there's a mob. He's like, I got this, oh, there's a riot. I got arrested. I got beaten. He's like, it's cool. I'm good. Can I have the mic? But then when they're like, hey, we're about to sacrifice a goat to you because you're Hermes, he's like, whoa. And it's like, no, stop. And what's interesting about that one actually is in that story in Acts, he's about to get worshipped. Barnabas are about to get worshipped as gods. And then literally one verse later, they are beaten and left for dead. Like that's how fast that switched, because it says, because Jews came down from Asia or whatever and started slandering him. And then that same group of people that was about to, sacrifice to him because they thought, he was a god, instead like beat him, leave him for dead outside the city. And God sort of has this little mini resurrection moment. So it shows you like the intensity again of the emotion. And the first century was like this. It was a massive time of upheaval. You had, Book of Acts is written prior to some of the most gnarly bits. But the year of 4 emperors or whatever, where you just got all of this massive political chaos. You've got this different sectarian religious competition. You've got, the number of times, when Gamaliel's like, well, that one guy rose up and led away a bunch of people, but then he got killed in the wilderness. And then that guy rose up and he gathered a following and they were going to overthrow the government, but then he got killed. And, they're just walking through all of these like attempted insurrections, these attempted coups and whatever else of turmoil, and going like in the early church is just right in the middle. And people are sometimes struggling to figure out, what are these people about? Like, what's their message? What are they saying? What are they doing? And the church is just like, you know what? We're going to worship together. We're going to absorb the persecution, and we're going to boldly proclaim Christ and let God handle the results.
It's fantastic. We could talk about Acts for a long time. I want to go back to the first part you were mentioning a minute ago on the courage in the household. I'm really intrigued by your line, or the question you asked us a minute ago. For the father, what is he leaning away from, or what is he flinching from? I'll just admit, I think that's a convicting question. I can think of things like, there are probably conversations that I should have had with my wife that I may have avoided. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more specifically to the need for courage in the household, particularly courage on the part of husbands and fathers, especially in light of the, you referenced that line. I've hated this line for years. If mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, is sort of just thrown off as a sort of a gimme line to the woman's happiness is the defining factor in the home, and that's really all that really matters. And it's always a very thin synonym. It's happiness in the sense of pleasure. It's not any sort of eudaimonia or ultimate excellence or fulfillment of the good. It's purely just a temporary emotional happiness. So speak a bit more to the role of courage in the home and the necessity for men in particular to not abdicate their responsibilities.
Yeah, and I think that last bit's precisely, you're responsible. So a big theme of the book is, what are you responsible for? And are you abdicating it, shirking it, blame shifting it? So, or are you actually leaning into it? And this is a hard thing for men. It's a weakness. And I think sometimes people hear that sort of thing and say, oh, so, the guy who sort of caters to his wife's desires, and we're trying to push back against that. They hear that as blaming women, when I'm actually saying, no, I'm actually blaming the man. Like, I'm saying he needs to be able to be a man enough to not paper over conflict or avoid it and just kind of acquiesce, but instead to lean into it, to actually have the hard conversation. And I think, again, the sort of first step there is to learn that you're doing it. So growing in your own self-awareness, where, when people have asked, like, what's kind of the most practical advice in the book? There's a lot of practical advice in the book, but one of the first one is paying attention to your hesitations, your reluctances, your passions, your reactions, when you blow up, when you shut down, like just learning to recognize when are you doing that, and then being able to kind of step outside of the emotional intensity of the moment and start asking yourself some hard questions. Like, where did that come from? What was my expectation? How did this, not meet it, and therefore that produced the anger? Or I can sense the fear. I'm trying to avoid some. interrogate and figure out, how am I actually operating? Not how do I want to operate or would say I'm operating, but actually on the ground, what are you doing? And then deciding, do I want to do that? Is this faithfulness right now? Or am I shirking? Am I avoiding? Am I abdicating? So that then, having gotten clarity about it, you can then enter back into the scenario, enter back in and say, okay, I need to actually calmly, patiently, clearly raise the issues. I need to ask my wife some questions. I need to be able to absorb her emotions and not fear it. Pastor Doug has a line where he always says, a man who cannot stand up to his wife cannot stand up for his wife. And that's true. Like there's an element, and godly women actually do respect this. Part of the lie is that giving in will make it go away, when actually it's now there's a loss of respect. She intuitively, her own emotions sort of intuitively lose respect for her husband if he's just a wet noodle who goes along because he wants to avoid conflict. And instead, when she sees I can push on him and he's sturdy, and he's not reactive, he's not blowing up or defensive, but he's instead going, okay, we've got a problem here. Let's work on it together, and tries to invite instead of seeing it in oppositional terms where she's the problem or he's the problem. This is a union of husband or wife. We have a problem, and I'm, as the husband, going to lead in us addressing it together. How do we actually solve this together? That's a powerful thing in a home, and it requires a husband to care more about what God thinks than what his wife thinks. He's got to really internalize, like, God's opinion here is more fundamental, and I need to lead and seek to please him, even at the risk sometimes of displeasing her in the moment. But hopefully in the long run, if God's gracious, that will earn her respect and admiration, and that will produce more joy in life in the household in general.
I'm reminded of Genesis 3 and the image of Adam standing there. Every time I've taught Genesis in a high school context, it's always fun to hear the students ask, well, what's going on with Adam? It seems like Eve is the one who is speaking in Genesis 3. She's the one that the serpent is speaking to. And where's Adam? And then we'll always go back and we'll read the text together closely one more time. And they hit that line. And Adam was there with her, and she handed Adam the fruit. And that passivity, I think, is still, I think there's something about men that we are particularly aligned with Adam in that moment, that our temptation is to passivity. But when we overcome that passivity, we're looking far more like Christ, who was not passive but active in saving and in leading and everything that he did. We're looking far more like him than we are like the first Adam. So I appreciate your words on courage there. Those are very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you, just kind of I want to wrap up the section on your book, and then I'd love to ask you about a bunch of random topics, because Joe, you have a knack for saying very clear things, and we're in an age that often lacks clarity. But are there any other? The only thing I want to ask about your book is, who was your audience in mind as you wrote this book? Who were you envisioning would benefit from this book?
Yeah, so there's sort of like a primary audience, I would say, and then there's a secondary one. So the primary is just anybody who's ahead. So could be at a household, at a elders in a church, school board, at a classical Christian school. If any Christian politicians end up picking it up and want to apply it to their context, it has all kinds of relevance for them as well. But really, any Christian who is in a position of leadership is kind of the main audience. However, I would also say that there's a kind of subordinate audience, which is all the followers or whatever you want to call them, the members of, so church members would benefit from it, not only because husband might be able to apply it in his own household, but also because it can give some insight into what they want to see their how can encourage them in it, because they actually can have a real encouraging dimension, right? So to say, hey, Pastor, we know that you were courageous there when you called that out, when you addressed it and you did it well, and that encouragement is a real blessing to a pastor. And so, for a wife to sit there and read and read the book, it's targeted more at men. because men are the head by God's design. But for a wife to read it and go like, oh, I don't want to try to manipulate or steer my husband in this way, and instead I want to encourage him, or I want to call him to take the responsibility that God wants him to have. And so I'm going to appeal to him and say, honey, I need you to step up. And in her better moment, she might say, and I don't want you to just cave to me in order to keep the peace. I want you to actually lean in and lead us as a family. So there's a secondary audience that I think could learn how do heads and bodies work together to accomplish the mission that God gives. But the fundamental audience is the leader, is the head of the household, or the pastors in the church, the leaders of the different institutions.
Now that makes a lot of sense to me. I think we're dealing with the aftermath, or maybe we're still in the middle of it, but definitely the aftermath of decades of excessive focus on democracy and thinking that all people are in fact equal. And to go back to you mentioned, so you took us to Shakespeare several minutes ago. One of my favorite passages in Shakespeare is one of his lesser known plays, Troilus and Cressida. But he has this great bit. I'm going to mangle it, but I'm going to try to quote a little bit of it. When hierarchy is untuned, and he goes into this whole soliloquy about hierarchy is the right structure of society. And when that hierarchy is gone, all of our ability to relate to each other as rightly ordered beings dissolves, because instead we're collapsed into a giant pool, and all that's left is just the struggle of might against might. And in that moment, most of us end up losing, and those who win are nothing but tyrants. And so I think the 20th century was really a century of trying to establish mass democracy. We've been in such a moment of almost hating the idea of a leader really making a call, making a decision. And you're reminding us, I think, in a helpful way that no, actually, it's a great good for the people in the organization when leaders do lead. And especially when they lead under God's authority, they have the right, they really are failing in their headship if they do not actually lead. And so I like your argument a lot.
Amen to that. Yep.
Joe, let's shift gears just a little bit. We've got just a few minutes left on today's episode, but I do really want to get your thoughts. And this episode, we're streaming live today, of course, but we'll probably have this one up, and my guess is about 6 or 7 weeks. So we'll be a little further away from some of these things by the time we get there. But I'd love to start. What on earth did you make of President Biden's proclamation of Easter as the Transgender Day of Visibility?
Yeah. So my take on this is like the Easter, the fact that it fell on Easter this time is at some level like a it's always on March 31st. It happened to be on Easter, and so my objection was more like, we shouldn't be doing this at all. Like, I don't care what day it falls on. This is insane. And so it was more offended. I think that Christians like took the opportunity, and I think it was an opportunity to sort of say, hey, you're actually going to do this on and draw attention to it on the sort of the holiest day of the Christian calendar. And so it does provide a kind of nice contrast of like, this is the choice of ways is before you. Which way are we going? But the truth is even it could have been, October 31st. It could have been, I don't care what day it is. Like, this is not, the colonization of the calendar by the Rainbow Brigade is a conquest. It's an attempt to sort of say, you know what, this is it's rainbow nationalism. It's pagan. We mentioned neo-paganism. That is sort of one of the fundamental battlefields of our day, and Christians have to just recognize that, like, if this is the choice, it's going to be Christ or chaos, and that's the chaos. This is what you're going to get. And I think the other thing is, I do think taking the opportunity afforded by the president was clear. Like, he made some things clear in order to appeal to. There was a good conversation on this online the other day about basically appealing to what you might call reality respecters. So in Acts, sort of the fields that were ripe for the harvest were both sort of Jews, but then Gentiles, and it was typically Gentile God-fearers, sort of the Gentiles who were loosely attached to to Judaism in some way, had some kind of affinity for it. There was some kind of commonality, and that was sort of the field that the early church, went to first. And it seems to me that now it may not, God-fearers would be a perfectly legitimate term. It's sort of the God and country folks who've been to church once in a blue moon, that still have some residual cultural Christianity in their background. But it even might just be, they may not have any Christian background because they've grown up in America in the late 20th, early 21st century, but they're still reality respecters, and they still and there's an aversion to the man stuff and just the overt ugliness of that whole movement. And it's like that group, getting clarity for that group and saying, no, we're standing on the side of reality. Men are men, women are women, marriage is marriage, children deserve a mother and a father. Planting those flags when the moment comes is a really good, it's faithfulness to God, and it's evangelistically potent. That's who there are people who will find their way into the faith because they recognize that the Christians were the last people to stand up and say, no, this is crazy.
It's fascinating to me how there are certain moments that provide so much clarity that the truth just stands out in sharp relief. I really like your phrase, reality respecters. And there were, at least my Twitter feed on Holy Saturday and Easter Sunday and the following Monday was just filled with people proclaiming the goodness of Christ and the truth of the resurrection. And that seemed to me to be a great response. Well, let's go to a slightly different issue, and this one will be more pertinent when this episode does drop on our podcast feed. This summer, the Southern Baptist Convention will gather in Indianapolis, and there will be they'll have the second year to consider a document called the Law Amendment that would be officially adding a piece to the Constitution of the Southern Baptist Convention. That the Law Amendment is specifically focusing on the already present but not correctly binding Southern Baptist conviction that only men can be pastors of church or can be pastors, period. Now, I'd love, with that as context, I'd love any thoughts you have either about the Law Amendment and or the liberal drift or takeover of the SBC. I don't know if you have a stance on the more conspiratorial type statements I've seen about that, but any thoughts you have on that would be great.
Yeah. So, a great, I'll just first commit an article. Michael Carlino wrote a great article. It was actually kind of a half book review, half book application. So he read Leadership and Emotional Sabotage and applied it to the SBC situation in a way that was really, really compelling. That drew the relevant threads together. And so you can find that, I think, at Christ Overall is the website that's on. Michael Carlino's article. It's a review of my book and an application. But one of the things there is the Law Amendment is, I think, a necessary thing for the SBC because it's where the battle is, it's where the fight is. And I suspect, I'm hopeful that the SBC is going to show up, the conservatives will show up in droves and pass it overwhelmingly, and it will result in some self-selection on the part of the more liberal elements in the SBC. They'll say, okay, we're not welcome here. And that will be good. The numbers may go down, but what's left will be far more potent because it will be more faithful to the scriptures. So I think in that sense, that sort of, gain by losing, to quote a former president of the SBC who's opposed, I think, the Law Amendment, but this would be a gain by losing, by being willing to say, you know what, we can't partner together because we're so divided on this fundamental issue of male headship in the church. On the liberal drift and takeover, I actually think that this is equally important for the SBC. Passing the Law Amendment will be important, but also, I don't know enough about the particular candidates who are running for president, but choosing someone who is going to have the kind of sober-minded leadership to not get steered by worldly perceptions and by the attempts to steer the SBC in relation to the abuse issue. And by that I mean actual abuse, actual sexual abuse or physical abuse is a horrible and horrific thing, and is why you can't entrust it to people who are trying to steer an entire denomination with it. And so, given how the SBC is structured, those sort of issues have to be handled at a local congregational level, and they ought to be. And if something were ever proven and you needed to disfellowship a church because they, didn't do it, great. But this sort of, spending the amount, that massive amounts of money that are being, the attempt to kind of treat the SBC like an entity that it actually isn't, as a sort of, it's responsible for all of what happens in its churches. And I think even the exaggeration of the extent to which there is an abuse crisis in the SBC, all of that, like that happened in that kind of 2017 to 2022 window, where there was this stretch where this was what was going on in the culture, and big news stories to come out, in the Houston Chronicle, where they found a certain number of abuse cases and nationalized the issue. And I think the SBC got steered. They abuse enablement was the label. They got slapped on the back, and now they steered it. And as a result, there's all kinds of legal liability. Churches are having to ask, do we really want to contribute to the SBC if the money's just going to go to these endless lawsuits that may now result? So all of that sort of thing, I think the only way through that, given what you have, is to elect, sober-minded leaders as the president, who can then appoint other sober-minded leaders to endure this present kind of ecclesiological crisis that the SBC's in. And so that's as important, I think, as the law amendment. The law amendment will be a stake in the ground. I expect it to pass. But in some ways, this is true in every polity, your documents are only as good as the men who are exercising authority. And if you have great documents, but compromised men, weak men, they'll find ways around it. And good laws just give sinners really creative ways to sin. That's all they do. And so you actually need to have men of courage, integrity, sober-mindedness, who aren't going to be steered by worldly pressure, but instead they're going to be faithful to God and seek to lead the SBC into what I hope could be a real season of renewal and fruitfulness for that denomination.
Well, that would be fantastic. And hopefully, I hope you're right about that and the results this summer. We've probably got time for one more, depending on how much you want to say here. But do tell me your thoughts about Russell Moore and David French over the last couple of years. What do you make of these guys? I ask in part because it seems to me, I could be overestimating this, but it seems to me that you're moving in sort of a slight public intellectual direction, and I've seen more of your writings in the last couple of years. Russell Moore and David French both went the direction of the very openly public Christian route, and they've been very loud about their views. So I'm curious what you make of them from where you sit.
Yeah, so I think in both cases, Russell Moore, 2006, man, you go read that some of the stuff he wrote back then, and it's remarkable. It's fantastic. It's actually very prescient in terms of the things that he was predicting and the things that he was resisting then. I think David French in some ways had a similar kind of moment where, as he was fighting the battle on campuses for free speech and campus tribunals that would, persecute people for being Christians or false abuse allegations. And so you look at kind of where they were, and there's a way in which you kind of want to quote 2006 Russell Moore against 2024 Russell Moore and say, this guy had it. And I think that there's a large, there's complex reasons, I'm sure, for them about why there's this drift. The most fundamental thing I think in the present moment is that having been given these larger platforms, editor of Christianity Today, New York Times columnist, there really would be an opportunity for them to sort of represent the Christian faith and Christians in general before the world's audience. Something that stuck with me is the way that I think someone like Ross Douthat, as a conservative Catholic, I think views his vocation as a journalist writing for the New York Times as, I'm going to try to explain and make comprehensible to a liberal audience the conservative Catholic faith. So I'm a conservative Catholic, and I'm going to try to sort of help you world understand what conservative Catholics are about, and to do so in a way that is compelling, right? That is charitable towards his church, even when it fails, but is trying to, that's the frame. It seems to me that both Russell Moore and David French have taken the opposite tack, which is to say, their role is, and the way that they tend to write is, I'm going to criticize my people before an audience that's already inclined against them. And this is it's a really ugly thing, I think. It's a good example of we're not like those Christians, and putting distance in order to ingratiate yourself to a hostile audience. And I think it can be justified, like the theological biblical justification is, I'm trying to be winsome. I want to communicate that. And one of the ways that people discover very quickly you can be winsome to an audience is to share their hostilities. Who do they hate? Who are they opposed to? And if you communicate in subtle and sometimes very overt ways, I don't like them either, then you'll be welcomed in. And I think this is and so on the one hand, they try to maintain at some level conservative positions, right? So we're pro-life, or we're pro, marriage, but they're the idea of the regime evangelical, who basically is the domesticated representative of evangelicalism that can be welcomed into progressive, elite society, and their role is to basically, dismiss or condemn their own tradition, their own church. And it's the opposite of, I think, what Douthat does. And so I think it's really sad and unfortunate. I think over the long term, it will make them irrelevant to any kind of renewal or revival. So that's at least the rough thoughts. It's a very sad trajectory, and one that ought to be a cautionary tale for a lot of folks.
Well, I think there's an enormous amount of value in consistency and the same trajectory over a long time. And I remember I didn't follow David French in 2006, but I remember being I was just finishing high school and heading to college, 2006, 2007. And I had Russell Moore was somebody I was just very excited was in the SBC, and that I think he was still an ethics professor then at Southern, but then when he became head of the RLC, I was just overjoyed. But I've been very sad over the last few years, and like his movement and the way he has compromised his previously very clear ethical positions as his reach has increased. I don't know if those two things are causally linked, but they're certainly correlated. On a hopefully much happier note, Dr. Rigney, what's next in your writing pipeline now that this current book is out? Is there another book in the works?
Yeah, there's always a couple that are kind of on the back burner that just kind of which one comes to the foreground. So I would say I do have I'd like to put together kind of probably a book of essays, basically collect the essays I've written on empathy more proper. So the current book addresses it, but kind of in a secondary sort of way. It's one piece of that larger project. But I've written probably 30 to 40,000 words over the last 7 years on empathy, compassion, and how that's underneath. And that's more and more people, I think, are recognizing the hijacking of empathy in our culture. And so I'd like to put that together and get that out there. That should be a relatively simple project if I can find the time. I've got a little book on Shakespeare that's kind of nearing completion that I hope to get out. That's on a couple of plays of Shakespeare that really highlights envy, rivalry, jealousy, insecurity, and Shakespeare really treats that theme in a really profound way. So those are two that are nearing completion, and then kind of lurking back there if I can ever find the time and ability. I've got two bigger projects. One is on Puddleglum. So get back into Narnia, but Lewis has some really amazing things to say about modernity and the challenge of living in modernity, and that Puddleglum scene in The Silver Chair is really profound as an analysis of the modern world and the challenge of holding on to the Christian faith in the face of modernity. And so I'd like to develop out, sort of Puddleglum's faith. How do you sort of keep the faith in this modern context? There's that project, and then the last one is I really would like to lean into the Christian, the Christendom conversation, political philosophy, Christian nationalism, and try to bring some more clarity to that whole thing, because I think a lot of times there's a couple of key questions in that conversation that I think once you can get clarity, you can find out where you're going to fall out. And so probably more of something along the lines of what Stephen Wolfe has done, but probably in a slightly different way, But I'm interested in that, and probably a little bit of a longer term project.
Well, I will certainly look forward to seeing both of those books hit the market at some point when life permits. I met both you and Stephen Wolf for the first time at the National Conservatism Conference down in Miami a while ago. And that was my first introduction to the whole Christian nationalism conversation. And I was initially very resistant to the term. I still don't love the term, but I at least have concluded that there is something very substantive and very significant that those who use the term or at least do that in a sane way are trying to communicate it. There is this fundamental connection between Christianity that's practiced by the people of America and the governance that we have. And if we confuse that, we don't get to some state of neutrality. We trade Christianity for some new religion, and that seems to me to be where we are today. So I think there's a lot of good that whether or not anybody ever actually manages to formulate a coherent political agenda, like that still seems to me to be missing. But there is still a lot of good that seems to come out of thinking through the positive connections between faith and government.
That's right. Yeah, that's a really important conversation.
Well, Dr. Rigney, how can people find and follow you online?
Only social media that I really spend any time on is on Twitter, X, or whatever it is now. Joe_Rigney is the handle there. Beyond that, I a couple of different places. If you're looking for older articles, there's a lot at desiringgod.org. I publish there quite a bit. More recently, there's quite a bit at American Reformer and World Opinions. I've written a number of things there. And then kind of the steady place will probably be the Canon app. So Canon Plus, if you're looking for some great family content and just lots of edifying things, but also stuff for the kids and whatnot, then Canon Plus is a great app that you should check out. And I've got a number of different things show up there. So those would be a couple of places anyway that you can find me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for joining me on the Optimistic Curmudgeon today. This has been a great conversation. Thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. Joe Rigney, Fellow of Theology at New St. Andrews College and author of the next book you need to order, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, Resisting the Anxiety That Will Wreck Your Family, Destroy your church, and Ruin the World. Out now from Canon Press. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful.